Hello everyone, Professor Philip Travis. This week in American history, we're going to be examining the Great Depression and the New Deal. And this is an era that I have dated from 1929 to 1939, but with these types of events, the exact date ranges are sometimes challenging. So I chose 1929 as that is, of course, in October 1929 when the stock market crashed. However, for those of you who already know a little bit about the Great Depression, you probably know that for some segments of American society, particularly farmers, the impact of foreclosures and these types of things were really being felt a number of years before the Great Depression. I've chosen 1939 as the end, and that's largely because that's when we see the beginning of the Second World War. And of course, by 1941, the United States' entry into the Second World War, first with the Lend-Lease program, which began in the spring of 1941, and then, of course, directly and militarily involved directly following the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941. But the stock market doesn't actually return to pre-Depression levels until the early 1950s. So whether or not 1939 is an exact end of the Great Depression period, for our purposes, yes, but there are some longer term sort of lasting effects in terms of this massive catastrophe that occurred in the United States, particularly to the American economic system and to American society. This week, if you're in my American history course, please make sure to view in our content modules area, view the readings and assignments section so you can see specifically what our assignments are for this week. If you are a student of mine or if you are just an outside viewer of the YouTube channel and you're interested in history stuff, subscribe to my channel, History Changes, by clicking that little button down there in the bottom of the screen. So the Great Depression and the New Deal. Of course, the Great Depression is the term that refers to this massive economic calamity that hit the United States, but not just the United States. This was a global economic event, massively affecting the United States, European economies, and then as a result of globalization, global trade, and of course the legacy of colonialism and empire has massive, massive far-reaching effects across the developing world as well. The Great Depression was felt massively in French Indochina, for example, in addition to its effects in European countries like France and obviously the United States. The New Deal is the name of the program of reforms, and theoretically you would say there's two New Deals. The New Deal, the first New Deal, and the second New Deal. And those are, of course, associated with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was inaugurated as president in 1933, replacing Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the Republican president, and he was, historically, Herbert Hoover has gained a great deal of criticism for the Great Depression, maybe to some extent unwarranted, but Herbert Hoover's policies did not in a meaningful way affect change in the United States during the first three years of this economic collapse. And this leads to the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic president, one of the most important presidents in American history. And his New Deal, the first New Deal and the second New Deal, created many, many lasting reforms that I imagine that either yourselves or somebody you know and love is close to you is in direct sort of, if you will, conversation with the reforms of the New Deal on a daily basis, even today in the 21st century. So first of all, just a really brief, the causes of the Great Depression. Generally speaking, there's a few causes. It's a complex event, but the causes really relate to the stock market, and particularly a very unregulated stock market, and a stock market that relied on a massive amount of speculating what sort of the future value of something would be, and then in connection to that speculation, investing with a great deal of debt, margin bidding was a widespread phenomenon at this time in all sectors of the market. Today, you could still margin bid, but you have to be a very, very financially secure investor, if you will, to margin bid. But there's a massive amount of debt in the stock market. Like a majority of the money by the late 20s that's invested in the stock market is borrowed money. And of course, you know, when you have a bunch of borrowed money in the stock market, the idea is that the stock market's going to go up, you're going to sell your stuff, and then you're going to get the money, you'll pay off what you owe, and you'll have the profit. But of course, if speculation has outrun the actual market value of these things, then the stock market, if those figures fall well below what you need to make that profit, then ultimately you just have debt. You lose a tremendous amount of money as the value of these things, whatever commodity or whatnot you might be investing in, collapses. And so that massive amount of debt in the market meant that when this crisis occurred, the stock market crashes in October of 1929, and all of these share values plummet. It means that a lot of people now owe a tremendous amount of debt to investment institutions, and they have no way to pay it back. They've lost all their money, but even more than that, they've lost borrowed money. Connected to that, too, there was also a banking crisis in the United States. The banking crisis was related to a large degree not only to the nature of foreclosure policies and loan policies, but the banking system also, commercial banks were participating in sort of playing the stock market. And so they would take the money that you invest in the bank and they would play the stock market. When the market crashes, that massive amount of sort of money that the banks had invested in the market results in bank closures. And during the Great Depression, when a bank closed, you lost everything. And this is one of the lasting reforms of the New Deal, one of the first reforms of the New Deal era, the Glass-Steagall reform, and in association with it, ultimately the creation of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And that means today you invest in a bank, a legitimate bank, and if the bank collapses, they will insure your savings up to a certain amount. I think in the 21st century it's $250,000. But up here on the screen you see this is a New York City bank, and this is a bank run. So during the Great Depression, when people became concerned that their bank might close because of a massive amount of loss of money, largely connected to its playing the market, people would rush the bank because they knew if they didn't get their money out, their money would be gone. And so people would try to then descend on the banks, and this creates, of course, a domino effect where people rush the banks, and then the banking institutions collapse. During Herbert Hoover's presidency, the Republican president, during the first 3 years of the Great Depression, 5,000 banks closed in the United States. And with those closures, they took people's life savings, whether or not people owed money or were playing on the stock market or not. People's homes were foreclosed during these bank closings. And so one of the long-lasting reforms were banking reforms. And for a long time period, the Glass-Steagall Act actually barred commercial banks from playing on the market. The United States changed that in the late 90s during Bill Clinton's presidency, and that was another factor that precipitated the Great Recession of 2008. Other factors leading to the stock market crash, the European economic crisis was a major factor in this. This was one of the ramifications following the First World War and the massive reparations payments that were kind of propped up, that Germany had to pay to the Allies, particularly Britain and France. But this repayment system was kind of propped up by the United States, and when the Great Depression occurs, of course, the European economic crisis accelerates. So these things were connected. And another factor was overproduction. You see here, this is Seattle, Washington, and this is a Hooverville. They called these Hoovervilles to mock the president, Herbert Hoover, who workers saw as doing nothing to help them in this crisis. Hoovervilles were oftentimes built, these were like makeshift sort of communities around workplaces. And so they would be built around areas where people hoped a job might open. And This is connected to one of the big causes of the Great Depression. That's a loss of jobs. Corporations were massively overproducing. Connecting to that overproduction, Americans were taking on greater and greater personal debt. And effectively, American consumers, the production of industrialists, of corporations, their production became so high during the age of sort of mass consumerism and mass production that people's consumption habits, their financial consumption abilities, could not keep up with that. And so as those overproduction, and this connects to the stock market crash as well, if you're speculating that a corporation will have, huge positive profits and therefore the value of their shares will go up, when they report that they're losing money because they can't sell all of the things they're producing effectively because they're overproducing, that results in their shares collapsing, their stocks collapsing, and the first thing corporations do is they fire employees because workers are the biggest overhead. So those are the main causes of the Great Depression. This, of course, again, when we look at the Great Depression, this was a unique sort of calamity in American society. And people rushed banks, banks closed, workers mocked the president, Herbert Hoover, building Hoovervilles that they dubbed, these makeshift communities that had none of the amenities that you would expect from proper housing. Your pocket turned inside out. They called Hoover flags, and newspapers were referred to as Hoover blankets. A Hoover flag meant you had no money. That's why your pocket was inside out. A Hoover blanket, newspapers, is what the poor, the homeless cover themselves up to stay warm at night. Hoover blankets and Hoover flags. Now, last thing I want to say, and this is really important, the Great Depression ushers in, of course, the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democrat president who was elected in 1932. And Roosevelt's New Deal, the first New Deal and the second New Deal, created long-lasting reforms in the United States. And in fact, for the next half century, really, up till the election of really Ronald Reagan in 1980, his inauguration in 1981, this was a period of time in American history that was referred to as the age of New Deal liberalism. And it was kind of like the progressive era. It was really built on this idea that the government could be used as a positive vehicle for reform. And of course, we saw some of these ideas in the progressive era. The New Deal sort of takes it to another level. And presidents following Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, all of these presidents following in the footsteps of of Roosevelt, in one way or another, even Republicans like Eisenhower sort of built on the legacy of this era of New Deal liberalism. And this brought many, many long-lasting changes to American society that are so ingrained in our country now that you might not even realize that these are landmark reforms. Here's a few examples. Social Security. So if you work and you receive a paycheck, you have deductions from Social Security. And the idea with this was that you would be paying into basically an old age government-based pension, a pension that would be free from like market volatility, so that when you got past the period of time when you're able to work, you could collect a Social Security check. And a big reason for this was because there was a massive problem with old age, elderly poverty during this time period. And so Social Security was created to try to provide some kind of supplemental support for the elderly in the United States. Unemployment insurance, homeowners relief. Ultimately, and of course there's many, many reforms of the New Deal. As I mentioned, the FDIC, farm loans and subsidy programs that were created, the original idea of supporting workers' unions, really, the legalization, the formal legalization, even the creation for a brief period of time of a government union known as the NRA, the National Recovery Association, the Blue Eagles as they were known by, was like a federal union. So you see the creation, the widespread embracing of workers' unionization at this time period, and the legacy of this period, of the New Deal, of this period of reform, is in subsequent presidents. You had things like the passage of the GI Bill of Rights. So if you know someone who served in the U.S. Armed Forces, Following World War II, the GI Bill of Rights provided federal funding for education and housing and so forth. And if a person signs up to join the service today, the GI Bill of Rights is used to incentivize that service. The minimum wage law is created during the presidency of Harry Truman. Medicare and Medicaid are created during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, part of his Great Society, which was really seen as his vision of sort of his own New Deal. And also other programs, WIC programs, food stamp programs, a myriad of types of assistance programs to help Americans stave off the most extreme elements of hardship, whether caused by poverty, a lack of work, economic conditions, or conditions relating to health care. So the Great Depression and the response to the Great Depression, the New Deal, creates an era in American history that lasts roughly 50 years, known as the era of New Deal liberalism. And this has brought Americans so many important reforms that we really engage with these reforms every single day, whether it's Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security or unemployment benefits, or you're part of a workers' union, or you're receiving the GI Bill of Rights. All of these are effectively engaging the idea of the New Deal. In some cases, like Social Security or unemployment insurance, for example, you are directly participating in programs created during the New Deal by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you're in my history class, summarize what you think are some of the most important points of that. And if anybody's interested in these types of videos, please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see everyone in the next video.